Coming up, the mystery man who committed murder on live television. It was an act of violence witnessed by an entire nation.
Jack Ruby bursts through the crowd, takes out the gun, and he steps into the history books.
Ruby's bullet left Lee Harvey Oswald dead, and also left questions that may never be answered.
The world will never know the true facts of what occurred.
There was no investigation. There was no serious investigation. There was an effort to prevent the facts from being heard.
Was he part of a vast conspiracy, or a citizen who wanted to avenge the president's death? A big-time mobster, or a small-time hood? We do know that Jack Ruby was arrested time and again throughout the 1950s, usually on minor charges that were later dropped. But with one shot in 1963, he joined the ranks of the 20th century's most famous criminals and most baffling. Join us for Jack Ruby on Trial.
It's late Sunday morning, November 24th, 1963, just 2 days after President Kennedy's assassination. In the basement garage of the Dallas Police Department, dozens of reporters and cameramen are waiting to get a glimpse of accused presidential assassin Lee Harvey Oswald as he is transferred to the county jail. Oswald is the focus of a nation's rage and bewilderment and the recipient of numerous death threats. Dallas police have stepped up security and stationed guards at every entrance to the building, but reporters continue to pile in.
Permitting the news cameras to congregate out there was just one of the many mistakes that we had made.
Shortly before 11 a.m., a stocky 52-year-old nightclub owner named Jack Ruby leaves his apartment and drives toward downtown. One of his dogs, a dachshund named Sheba, comes along for the ride. Jack Ruby's route takes him past Dealey Plaza, the site of the president's murder. Just after 11 a.m., he parks across from the Western Union office on Main Street, 1 block from police headquarters. Ruby saunters into Western Union and arranges to wire money to a stripper who works at his club, Karen Little Lynn Bennett.
We know that Ruby at 11:17 was at the Western Union office, because we have a time-stamped receipt of his having sent this telegram to Little Lynn. He left his dog in his car. He left the keys to the ignition and his billfold in the trunk of the car. He left the key to the trunk in the glove compartment of his car, and he left the car door unlocked.
It takes Ruby little time to walk the 350 feet from Western Union to the police station. Even though the building is heavily guarded, Ruby somehow slips undetected into the garage. He blends into the crowd of reporters and waits.
People who remember him arriving say that he arrived about 30 seconds before Oswald walked out the door.
At 11:21 a.m., television cameras are rolling as the elevator door opens and Oswald emerges, flanked by detectives on each side.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's a man with a gun. It's absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Detectives have their guns drawn. Oswald has been shot. There is no question about it. Oswald has been shot.
When I saw Ruby coming, which I did, I saw him as he stepped out. I didn't have time to do much. I tried to pull him behind me. Certainly the expression on my face there shows that I was totally surprised by it.
Officers leap to wrestle Ruby to the ground. As he is subdued, he turns to a policeman and gasps, "I'm Jack Ruby. Don't you know me?" Newsmen at the scene scramble to put the pieces together.
Did you know the man? Did you see the man before?
Yes.
You saw his face?
Yes, sir.
And you knew him?
Yes, sir. Pat, he is a resident of Dallas, is he not? Yes, sir. And that's all I'd want to say about the man himself.
Those in the basement of the Dallas Police Department are not the only eyewitnesses. Millions of Americans watch the shooting live on television.
We saw this figure shoot Oswald, and I had no idea who it was. 5 minutes later, the phone rang, and it was the London Times, wanting to know if I knew that Jack Ruby had just shot Oswald. And of course, I was just in a state of shock.
An ambulance rushes Oswald to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where President Kennedy was pronounced dead less than 48 hours earlier. It doesn't take long for doctors to determine that Ruby's single shot has caused extensive damage to Oswald's internal organs.
It ripped through his kidneys, liver, spleen, severed the two main blood vessels. He was beyond saving. He had lost too much blood.
Oswald expired at 1:07 p.m. Died? He died at 1:07 p.m. We have arrested the man. The man will be charged with murder.
Who is he?
The suspect's name is Jack Rubenstein, I believe. He goes by the name of Jack Ruby.
I had the radio on, local nightclub owner with a gray felt hat shoots Oswald. And I said, well, that sounded like Jack, because he always wore that gray felt hat. And then they said Jack Ruby shot Oswald. I myself went hysterical. I didn't want to believe it.
Joyce Gordon, one of Ruby's nightclub dancers, goes to police headquarters to try to see her boss. Instead, she winds up answering reporters' questions.
Jack was very, very upset Friday. And I say this, he was a grief-stricken man like many other people. But he said nothing of doing this himself. I don't believe Jack is actually the type of person that would think about killing someone and go out and do it.
Meanwhile, authorities continue to interrogate Ruby upstairs in the same building.
One of the stories that Jack told at one time or another, supposedly in his initial interrogation, was that he wanted to save Jackie Kennedy the horror of having to come back for a trial.
But later, to his brother Earl, he expresses remorse.
He said, I was hoping he wouldn't die. He was dead already, Oswald. He said, I didn't expect him to die.
Jack Ruby's shocking crime unleashes wild speculation that something sinister is happening in Dallas. If there was a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy, then Ruby's single shot has just silenced the man who knew the truth.
Nothing was more effective in destroying evidence than the role played by Jack Ruby in killing Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald was the single most important piece of evidence, so it was essential that there be no trial. It was essential that he be killed.
On November 25th, 1963, Jack Ruby is sitting in his cell at the Dallas County Jail. He's been in police custody for 24 hours as authorities try to sort out the details of the previous day's stunning murder. Ruby is no stranger to the men in blue. They recognize him as the eager-to-please owner of the Carousel, a local nightclub and strip joint. He was a frequent visitor at police headquarters, and on more than one occasion, he'd come bearing sandwiches for the officers.
He said, let's go take a walk over at the police station, because they all knew him. And as we walked along the halls there, all you would hear is, hi, Jack, hi, Jack, hi, Jack.
Now these same officers are assigned to help the FBI dig into his background. This is what they learn. Ruby is born Jacob Rubenstein in Chicago in 1911, one of 9 children. His family lives in a tough Jewish neighborhood on the city's west side. As a young man, Jack develops a reputation as a small-time hustler and willing street fighter.
My sisters used to work downtown, and they were harassed when they walked home from the streetcar because it was in a bad neighborhood. Well, Jack became their bodyguard. He would meet them at the corner where the streetcar stopped and walk them home every night. And Jack could handle himself. He was a rugged character.
In 1937, Jack gets a job as an organizer for the mob-infiltrated Scrap Iron and Junk Handlers Union.
He was involved with booze, with corrupt unions, and with gambling as he grew up in Chicago. In all of those relationships, Jack was not the central figure. He was always on the margins and a wannabe. That's the best description of him.
He may have even been linked to Al Capone.
There's some indication that Jack Ruby was a runner as a young man for Capone, taking messages from the gym to downtown.
In 1943, 32-year-old Jack Rubenstein is drafted into the Army Air Force. For Jack, the war is intensely personal.
He told me he's going over to Germany to try and kill Hitler. That's the way he was. He made up his mind he's going to kill Hitler. Why? He's got a reason for things like that. He wants to just show the world that Jews have guts.
Earl talks his brother out of going to Germany. Jack serves stateside for 3 years as a mechanic. A year after his discharge in 1946, Jack moves to Dallas to help his sister Eva manage a nightclub. Although this first endeavor is a flop, Jack is confident he can make his mark in booming Texas. Everywhere he looks, he sees evidence of new wealth, and he wants a piece of it. He's convinced a change in name will help him reach his goal. From now on, he will be known as Jack Ruby. Over the next 16 years, Ruby tries his hand at running 6 different nightclubs. All of them lose money.
He was a lousy businessman. He carried his tax records in the trunk of his car. Everything was disordered. Everything was chaos.
But in 1960, Ruby's efforts finally pay off when he and an investor open a burlesque club called the Carousel, located on Commerce Street in the heart of the city.
The clubs in downtown Dallas especially were very nice clubs. They required coat and tie for a man. The women that came in with men were all dressed very neat, nice. It wasn't a cheap atmosphere at all.
Almost every night, the Carousel Club draws a crowd. And Ruby, who often fills in as the MC, loves being the center of attention.
We went over there one afternoon, and there was Jack Ruby up on stage with a complete white cowboy outfit with this big 10-gallon hat. He just looked ludicrous. And he was up there telling jokes. And the only one laughing was Jack. He'd tell a joke and just get hysterical.
Ruby makes friends with many regulars, including several cops and mobsters. He also goes to great lengths to help out his dancers.
Jack was good to me and good to many of the other girls that worked for him. As long as you did your job, he would help you in any way he could. I'd known he loaned money to other girls, helped them. It was like his little family.
Jack's personality was very strange to describe because he had 2 different sides to him. One was that he was a very loving and caring person, and then in a matter of a blink of an eye, he would become violent.
In one of his worst episodes, Ruby gets into a brawl with a man who bites his left index finger. When Ruby finally shakes him off, his fingertip is dangling by a thread. Doctors have no choice but to amputate. Ruby's temper also gets him in trouble with the law. He's been arrested for a variety of offenses, including disturbing the peace, carrying a concealed weapon, and assault. It doesn't take long for FBI investigators to construct a clear picture of an explosive and unbalanced man. On November 29, 1963, President Lyndon Johnson, in office only a week, calls Michigan Congressman Gerald Ford from the Oval Office.
He said, "Jerry, I'm putting together a commission to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. Will you serve?" Well, I said, "President Johnson, I've got a full-time job as a member of the Congress. I've got serious committee responsibilities. I don't have time." He said, "You have an obligation to the country to serve on this commission."
President Johnson cajoles, sweet talks, and strong-arms 6 other men into joining Ford on a panel chaired by Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren. The President's Commission on the Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, known as the Warren Commission, faces a daunting task. With Oswald dead, there will be no trial for the president's murder, so the Commission's word on the case will be final, or so it is hoped. 4 days after the Warren Commission's first meeting, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover presents the findings of the Bureau's own investigation to Chief Justice Warren. The FBI concludes that Ruby and Oswald both acted alone. Period. There was no conspiracy. But not everyone is satisfied with this explanation, including some staffers on the Warren Commission.
We wanted to prove that the FBI was wrong. We wanted to find significant errors in the FBI's work. If we could have found a conspiracy, we would have been national heroes.
To complete its assignment, the Warren Commission employs a small army of investigators. They cover many fronts, but conquering the Jack Ruby mystery is essential. Some call it the Rosetta Stone of the Kennedy assassination. Figure it out, and you've solved the whole mystery. First, the commission tackles the widespread rumors that Ruby somehow knew Oswald.
Probably there were a half a dozen reports of that sort, of people who claimed that they had seen Oswald at the Carousel Club or some other place with Ruby, and these were the things that we went to first.
Investigators conclude, however, that all of these witnesses lack credibility and that there's no solid evidence linking the two men. They turn their attention to another mystery: how Ruby got into the heavily guarded basement of the Dallas Police Department with a loaded .38 caliber revolver.
That was really the central focus for a long time of the investigation, because if someone knowingly permitted Ruby to get into that basement, then that was a possible link to a conspiracy.
Many members of the Dallas Police Department are well acquainted with Jack Ruby.
A lot of people knew Ruby. He'd been in business here for a number of years. A good many police officers knew him too. I knew him. He'd invited me down several times, my partner and I, but what he was doing just wasn't my cup of tea.
Strangely, none of the guards who had been stationed at the building's entrances admits to having seen Ruby come in. So the commission, finding no hard evidence to the contrary, is forced to accept Ruby's version of events.
The Warren Commission accepted the claim that he came down the Main Street ramp because Ruby said he came down the Main Street ramp. But I must say that I've never been confident of that. I think that there were all sorts of reasons why Ruby might want to say something that would not implicate police officers. So it's a mystery as to how he got in.
Even more difficult for investigators to pin down are Ruby's alleged ties to organized crime and whether they were the motive for murdering Lee Harvey Oswald.
We attempted through telephone records and other things to develop a day-by-day chronology of everything that Ruby did, with the thought that if there were any linkage from Ruby to somebody else, either directly to Oswald or to somebody else who knew Oswald, that we might see some kind of a pattern.
What that pattern of phone calls show in the months before the assassination is an acceleration in the number of calls. They went not only to his friends and financial backers, they went to people who were known to be mob-connected.
They learned that Ruby placed several calls to a club in New Orleans owned in part by mafia boss Carlos Marcello. Other calls were made to underworld figures associated with the Teamsters Union in Chicago and to a casino manager in Las Vegas connected to Florida mob boss Santo Trafficante. Ruby has already given the FBI a handy explanation for the calls. He maintains that he was simply trying to get advice from men who might have union influence. It seems that his chief competitor in Dallas, Abe Weinstein, owner of the Colony Club, was using non-union dancers, and Ruby was furious about it.
Abe was getting amateurs to come up out of the audience and go up on stage and strip, and doing 10 times the business Ruby was doing. Jack hit the roof, and he went to the union and tried to get them to do something about the fact that he was using amateurs.
The Warren Commission also discovers that in 1959, Ruby made at least 2 trips to Cuba, where he stayed at a mob-owned casino. Ruby admits to only 1 trip and insists that it was just a vacation. Ultimately, the commission concludes that Ruby's ties to the underworld have nothing to do with his killing of Oswald and the assassination of the president.
There's no doubt in my mind that as far as Ruby was concerned, his murder of Lee Harvey Oswald was not connected to any mob connections or any foreign connection.
I think he was a wannabe. He wanted to be part of that, but they would never let him be in because When you're part of a mafia, you don't say anything. You're cool, you don't say anything. And he just talked about everything.
The investigators' next step is to retrace Ruby's whereabouts on the fateful weekend. They hope it will unearth clues as to whether Ruby was recruited to silence Oswald. This is what they find out. On Friday morning, November 22nd, Ruby arrives at the Dallas Morning News to place an ad for his nightclub. A short time later, reports of the attack on the president's motorcade quickly spread through the Morning News building. According to a reporter who's standing nearby, Ruby is visibly shaken when he learns that Kennedy has been shot. At 1:30 that afternoon, Ruby leaves and goes to his club. He decides to close the carousel for 3 days out of respect for the slain president.
Jack was there at the club. He was hysterical. He didn't even know that we were there. He told the bartender to close up for the weekend. And he did say to me that he would shoot the man that did it if he had a chance.
News footage reveals that Ruby had several opportunities to carry out his threat. That evening, he poses as a reporter and watches while witnesses pick Lee Harvey Oswald out of a lineup.
He was there for the lineup on Friday night, and he had one of these pads, stenographer's pad. He said I was making like a reporter, you know.
Jack Ruby was somewhere who had to be where the action was. Where was the action that weekend, November 22nd in Dallas? It was where the jail cell was and the accused assassin and all the press. Oswald walks a couple feet in front of Ruby on Friday night. Ruby has his pistol with him. He says it to the police later. There's a picture of him from the back, and you can see the pistol pulling up on his jacket.
Investigators learn that later that night, Ruby drives across town for spiritual support.
Jack went to the synagogue, and the rabbi there told me, he says, Jack cried like a baby, and I know he really loved the president.
Shortly before midnight, Ruby returns to police headquarters for a scheduled press conference with Oswald. Television cameras catch Ruby as he tries to blend in with members of the press. When the prisoner is nearly trampled by over-eager reporters, the police chief escorts Oswald back to his cell. On Saturday, November 23rd, after very little sleep the night before, Ruby is restless. Witnesses report seeing him at various locations throughout the day, including police headquarters, the Carousel, and Dealey Plaza. After a late phone call to his sister Eva, Ruby goes to bed at approximately 1:30 a.m. On Sunday morning, Ruby is up early. At 10:19, he receives a call from one of his dancers, Karen Bennett, in Fort Worth. She is in desperate need of money. He promises to wire her $25 as soon as he can. A few minutes later, Ruby leaves his apartment and gets in his car. To many, this sequence of events does not suggest someone who's been hired to silence Oswald.
Ruby parks his car, Blockaways, Western Union, goes in, waits in line. He's in no rush, doesn't make a telephone call, doesn't receive a call, waits for the person in front to pay for their bill, goes up, sends his $25 MoneyGram. It's timestamped by the clerk, 11:17. Oswald's killed at 11:21.
The final moment when Ruby and Oswald crossed paths would seem to be the result of stunning coincidences and near misses. Even the slightest change or delays would have prevented the shooting. The question before the Warren Commission, was it really chance or part of an elaborate web of deceit?
If there had been a detective in front of Oswald instead of behind him and on each side, if Oswald had left the interrogation room even earlier, if Ruby had spent 20 more seconds at Western Union, he would have missed his opportunity. So all of these things make it impossible for this to have been a planned murder.
But others would see a method behind Ruby's seemingly random encounters with Oswald.
It is hard to argue that that's serendipitous. There's much more accurate description of that evidence is that he was stalking him. And that he may have gotten to him with some serendipity doesn't indicate that it was not the product of a conspiracy.
Jack Ruby, who committed murder on national television, needs a lawyer. After a nationwide search, his brother Earl hires colorful San Francisco attorney Melvin Belli, the so-called King of Torts. Lawyer Joe Tawnahill from Jasper, Texas, also signs on to assist with Ruby's defense. Days later, Belli and Thornhill visit the Dallas County Jail for their first meeting with their new client.
He thought he was a hero. He thought he'd done what people in Dallas wanted him to do. And he laughed and said, "Joe," said, "you make a nice impression." He said, "You think I get the chair?" I said, "Well, Jack, if you get it, don't sit down in it." And boy, he jumped up and down, thought that was the funniest thing he ever heard.
Ruby is also paid a visit by his friend, Breck Wall.
The first thing out of his mouth is he wanted me to be president of his fan club. And I said, "Jack, what on earth are you talking about?" He said, "Breck, I've gotten letters, I've gotten telegrams, thousands of them, that are so happy that I did this." And I said, "Well, you also have a lot of people that are pissed at you." And he said, "I'm a hero." And I went, "No, Jack, you're not a hero."
Even though Ruby is receiving fan mail from across the country, his attorneys fear that a jury won't appreciate Ruby taking the law into his own hands, especially a jury from Dallas. They make a motion for a change of venue.
It was a poisoned atmosphere. Well, you can just say, look, Jack Ruby brought the scorn of the world down on him by killing the man that killed the president before he ever had a chance to get anything out of him.
Judge Joseph Brown denies their motion. On March 4th, 1964, as the trial begins in the county courthouse, all eyes are on Dallas. Reporters are eager to somehow link Jack Ruby to a conspiracy, but defense attorneys only allow questions that do not relate to Ruby's case.
Do you do any exercise to keep fit?
Yes, I do push-ups and sit-ups and a lot of good stomach exercises.
During the 9-day trial, the prosecution calls 19 witnesses. All are chosen to prove that Jack Ruby acted with malice when he killed Oswald, warranting a death sentence. No witness is more damning than Dallas Police Sergeant Patrick Dean. Dean testifies that about 10 minutes after the shooting, he was in the holding cell as the Secret Service questioned Ruby. Their conversation was not recorded, but Dean maintains Ruby said he'd thought about killing Oswald 2 nights earlier when he saw him at the lineup. His reason? He wanted the world to know that, quote, Jews have guts. The prosecution then presents as evidence the dramatic television footage of the murder.
I'm sitting between he and Belli, and he grabbed me and said, "Joe, is that me? Did I do that? Is that really me?" I said, "Yes, that's you, Jack, and just be quiet."
The prosecution rests. The defense has gambled that it can win an acquittal for their client on an insanity plea. His lawyers call medical experts to testify that Jack Ruby suffers from a mild form of epilepsy. They stun the courtroom by arguing that Ruby shot Oswald while suffering from a seizure.
You can commit an antisocial act during that state and have no recall of having done it when you come out of it, and it's usually triggered by something very exciting, like all the flash bulbs and everything going off when Oswald was coming out.
One witness is conspicuously silent, Jack Ruby. The defense believes that Ruby is too volatile to put on the stand. Lead attorney Melvin Belli bets everything on the persuasiveness of the medical evidence, though Joe Thornhill has his doubts about this decision.
If he'd have gotten on the witness stand and presented himself and demonstrated his love for Jack Kennedy and his admiration for him, the jury might have given him some sympathy, but they didn't have any sympathy for him.
As the trial draws to a close, Ruby becomes increasingly depressed. His brothers and sisters do all they can to comfort him.
He says earlier, "Don't spend any more money on lawyers. I know what they're going to do with me. They want to send me to the chair." He said, "Don't spend any money. Go home and forget about me." That's what he said.
On Saturday, March 14th, Judge Brown prepares to read the jury's verdict. For the first time during the trial, television cameras are allowed into the courtroom.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder with malice as charged in the indictment and assess his punishment at death. Signed, Max E. Causey, Foreman. So say you all, ladies and gentlemen. Is that your unanimous verdict? Will all of you whose verdict that is, please hold up your right hands.
Ruby is immediately escorted upstairs to an isolated cell in the county jail. The trial ends without shedding any light on Jack Ruby's possible involvement in a conspiracy. In fact, District Attorney Henry Wade has proceeded under the assumption that Oswald and Ruby both acted alone.
That's the theory we tried the case on entirely.
6 months after the Warren Commission was formed, Chief Justice Earl Warren decides that it is finally time to speak to Ruby in person. On June 7, 1964, the Chief Justice and Congressman Gerald Ford traveled to Dallas to question Ruby at the county jail.
We asked him, did you murder Lee Harvey Oswald because of any mob connections? He said no. We asked him, did you murder Lee Harvey Oswald because of any foreign connection? He adamantly said no.
But while answering the commission's questions, Ruby insists that he has something bigger to reveal.
He said, take me to Washington. I'll tell you everything. I can't talk here. My life is in danger if I talk here. Please take me to Washington. Earl Warren said, if you believe your life is in danger in talking to us, then I would advise you don't tell us anything.
The commission decides not to take Ruby to Washington. In an interview with reporters after his interrogation, Ruby delivers a cryptic message.
The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. I'm the only person in the background that knows the truth pertaining to everything relating to my circumstances. The people that had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
But the Warren Commission is finished with Jack Ruby. On September 24, 1964, after spending almost 10 months compiling millions of documents, the commission presents its 888-page report to President Lyndon Johnson. It states that both Ruby and Oswald acted alone and that it could find no evidence of a conspiracy.
The Warren Commission said, we found no evidence of a conspiracy, foreign or domestic. We didn't say there was no conspiracy. We said we found no evidence.
The Warren Report's official findings are released in September 1964. Jack Ruby is found to have acted alone. Meanwhile, he awaits execution in his cell at the Dallas County Jail overlooking Dealey Plaza, the site of JFK's assassination. As his lawyers work on an appeal of his death sentence, Ruby has a nervous breakdown.
He tried to commit suicide 3 times pending his appeal. Tried to put his finger up in the light socket. He ran his head into the wall, and then he got a piece of his coveralls and was making a hangman's noose out of it. And he was really deteriorating badly.
Isolated and depressed, Ruby begins to unravel. He shows increasing signs of paranoia.
He used to say, listen, can you hear the sounds downstairs? They're killing the Jews. They're boiling the Jews again. He used to think they were killing thousands and thousands of Jews inside the jail cells. So it became a fixation of his. Later, he became convinced that he was part and been unwittingly moved into a conspiracy to further embarrass the Jewish people by killing Oswald.
Ruby's physical health also appears to be failing, but prison doctors write off his complaints as the ravings of a madman.
He was complaining for a couple of years that he had pains in his chest. To me, all the time. He says, I still got the pains. What do you think they were giving him? Pepto-Bismol.
On October 5th, 1966, Ruby learns that the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals has overturned his verdict. The court concludes that he should have been granted a change of venue and that statements made to police immediately after the shooting should have been disallowed as hearsay. However, by this time, Ruby is seriously ill. In December, he's moved to Parkland Hospital, where he is diagnosed with cancer of the liver, brain, and lungs. An armed guard is placed outside his room, but family and friends are allowed to visit. On one occasion, Earl Ruby, accompanied by one of his brother's lawyers, smuggles a tape recorder hidden in a briefcase into Jack's room to record an interview about his murder of Oswald.
All I did was walk down there, down to the bottom of the ramp, and that's when the episode happened. It happened so fast and everything else, I can't recall what had happened from the time I came to the bottom of the ramp until the police officers had me on the ground.
Did you ever know Oswald before?
Never have known him or seen him before.
Had you ever planned anything like this?
I was so emotionally upset for 3 days.
Is there any truth at all to the stories that Oswald had lived in your club or anything?
None whatsoever. It's just fabrication.
This would be his final interview. On January 3rd, 1967, Jack Ruby dies of a blood clot.
And the blood clot went to his heart and killed him instantly. And they were going crazy there with that machine. They pump your chest and all that stuff. And I was sitting right there.
Earl accompanies his brother's body as it is flown to their hometown, Chicago. The funeral at West Lawn Cemetery is attended by dozens of family and friends from across the country. Jack Ruby is technically innocent of all charges because of his successful appeal, but speculation about his motive for killing Oswald is far from being put to rest. In the 1970s, criticism of the Warren Report increases in step with a general distrust of government.
There was a lot of doubt in the country. It was called credibility gap. It began then, and it's never gone away, and it will never go away until the American people are told the truth about who killed our president.
In 1975, a committee chaired by Idaho Senator Frank Church discovers that in the early 60s, the CIA was secretly working with the mafia to assassinate Fidel Castro. This disclosure takes the American public by surprise. It also shocks some of those who had worked on the Warren Commission.
The commission was betrayed. The withholding of any information from us that would have shed some light on either motive or the conspiracy itself was extremely important to us.
Ruby's phone calls to underworld figures, his frequent contact with mobsters at the Carousel, and his trips to Cuba are now seen in a whole new light. To discover if this new evidence had any bearing on the assassination of President Kennedy, the House Select Committee on Assassinations sets out to re-examine whether there was a conspiracy. One of the many witnesses re-interviewed is Wally Weston, a comedian who worked for Jack Ruby at the Carousel Club. Although committee members are not convinced he is a reliable witness, Weston claims he got into a fight with Oswald after Oswald heckled him at the club.
But it is important that a connection be made between Oswald and Ruby and Cuba. Now this can be substantiated only by the fact that I say he did know Oswald. That's the one part of my testimony that they cannot break down, because I know that the man I hit was Oswald. And I know that there are only 3 people in the world who know it. That's Jack and Oswald and me.
The committee also takes a hard look at the Mafia's possible role in the murder of John F. Kennedy.
Unlike the Warren Commission, the Select Committee on Assassination took seriously the possibility that organized crime, and by that I mean the Mafia, La Cosa Nostra in New York, the outfit in Chicago, call it what you want to, had in fact plotted the death of the president.
In its final report, issued in July 1979, the Select Committee on Assassinations concludes that the murder of President Kennedy was most likely the result of a conspiracy, and that mob leaders Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello are possible suspects.
The motive would have been the existence of the most vigorous anti-organized crime program in the history of the country, launched by Robert Kennedy.
Jack Ruby's role is brought into question once again. This time, many suspect that he was recruited by the mob after the assassination to silence Oswald.
They've got to get somebody who is connected to them, but unconnected to them. Somebody who is violent and known to be violent. Somebody who needs their support, wants their support. Somebody who has access to the police department freely, and Jack Ruby, in that sense, is the perfect person. This is not the mission impossible. This is the dream mission that he had been waiting for all his life.
But by the late 70s, the trail of evidence has gone cold. No further prosecution is possible. As a result, the JFK assassination and Ruby's motivation for killing Oswald remain the greatest murder mysteries of the 20th century.
It's always good to blame it on the mafia. I mean, if we can blame everything on the mafia, that works out really well. Nobody likes the mafia.
Ruby never thought he'd be charged for murder. They'd say, Jack, you did the right thing. You took the stain off of Dallas. You've restored some honor to this city by killing that fellow. That's not what happened.
It's one of history's mysteries. There's the Jack Ruby of the Warren Commission without significant organized crime ties, and there is the Jack Ruby of history, which is there were significant organized crime ties. Which one is the whole truth? People have to make that judgment for themselves.
On the same day that Jack Ruby killed Oswald, there was another shot that also made history. Still photographer Bob Jackson snapped his camera the exact instant Ruby's bullet found its target. His photo of Oswald crying out in pain earned Jackson a Pulitzer Prize. The original negative of his famous photo is in a safe deposit box, locked up as tight as the mysteries that will always surround Jack Ruby. To discover more about this and other topics, please visit our search engine at historychannel.com.